Hello world, it's Rob here, flying solo for this very special interview edition of the Doctor Who show, which I guess all kicked off just recently when I was on Twitter and I noticed a post from 10 Acre Films. Now, you might know 10 Acre for its excellent film work. Indeed, if you're like me and you've devoured the Season 24 Blu-ray set earlier this year and thought, gee, this Here's to the Future documentary, that's very good, isn't it? Well, that was 10 Acre Films' handiwork. As it turns out, however, this post wasn't about a film they've made or anything like that, but rather a book they're going to publish on November 1st this year. Because as well as republishing some great Doctor Who material that's fallen out of print in recent times, 10 Acre is about to put out a book, an all-new book, called The Long Game, 1996 to 2003, the inside story of how the BBC brought back Doctor Who. And you know, I can't lie, this is a topic that fascinates me a great deal. Indeed, we often talk on this podcast, Dave and I, about how Doctor Who fans, above and beyond the fans of other genre TV shows, often become very, very fascinated with the behind-the-scenes stuff, almost as much as what's happening in front of the cameras on Doctor Who. So, in short, this book appearing and its topic was like manna from heaven for me, and I duly pre-ordered a copy. Anyway, one thing led to another, as it often does, and I was soon chatting with the book's author, Paul Hayes, and it seemed such a no-brainer to just sit down and turn the mics on and have a yarn about the book, which is, well, it's what we're going to do right now. Paul, how are you?
Yes, very well, thank you. Very pleased to be on the show and having an opportunity to tell people more about the book. And I think this is the first time I think this might be the first time I've ever appeared on a Doctor Who podcast. So it's very exciting.
Oh, fantastic. Well, look, let me say from my side, I'm delighted to have you on the podcast today, as I'm absolutely fascinated by the book. Indeed, I'm a pre-order for the book, which is how we met online. And I guess I could start by reading the publisher's blurb, but if I've got the author on the line here who can describe it in his own words, I'd be crazy not to start with the obvious question, Paul. What's this book about?
Basically, it's my attempt to tell as clearly as I can the story of what happened between May 1996, the aftermath of the TV movie, and that not going any further, to the point in that wonderful day in September 2003 when we heard the news that came out of the blue for the vast majority of us that the show had been recommissioned, and explain why actually that didn't come out of the blue. I mean, the whole process that happened, the changes that took place within the BBC, particularly in the drama department over those 7 years, the changes at BBC One, the different attempts to bring the show back in different proposals for films, TV series, pitches during that time. There was a lot going on, and a lot of it has been talked about in different documentaries and interviews and articles down the years, but I didn't feel there was anything that pulled it all together as one narrative, one story, and explained some of the background and context of what was happening in the BBC during those years and in British television. So that's my attempt to try and do that, to tell that story, the story of those 7 years in context.
Right. Well, it's very interesting because you mentioned change at the BBC, and even in recent years we've had change, like the drama department giving away to BBC Studios, and now, of course, Doctor Who will be this sort of co-production with Bad Wolf as well. And when big or even controversial things happen in Doctor Who, we often comment on the show with, of course, we'll learn more in about 20 years' time when people are ready to talk. And I guess here we're talking about a story that began 25 years ago, if we're talking about the TV movie. And even 2003 was 18 years ago now. So perhaps it was just the right time for people to talk to you on the flip side of the coin? Is that sort of how things worked out?
Yeah, I think so. The fact that there was more distance from it. In fact, I think I got very lucky without knowing it, particularly with talking to Julie Gardner and Jane Tranter, who very kindly spoke to me last year, gave me interviews. And of course now they are back involved with the show again with their production company Bad Wolf. So I suspect perhaps if I was doing it now, they might have felt, now they're involved in it again, they might not have been able to speak to me. So I got very lucky in that respect. But yes, people like Lorraine Heggessey, who was the controller of BBC One when the show came back, Mal Young, who was one of the central figures in the drama department, the head of drama series, or controller of continuing drama series as he became. and all sorts of people who were involved in various stages of the story. The people who were running BBC Worldwide, Rupert, Gavin and Mike Phillips, who were very behind the film. They tell their side of the story and why they were keen to make a film. And there's all sorts of people who had these. I was amazed, really, because I'm this complete nobody, you know. And I was amazed that so many of these people were willing to have a chat with me, just dropping them an email explaining what I was doing and why, and so many of them were willing to speak to me.
Oh, it's fabulous. I mean, how many people do you think you spoke to all up for the book?
Oh, it's somewhere, I can't remember the exact figure. It's over 30. It's somewhere around 30, 35. Not all people who worked for the BBC. It's some people who are helping provide context and background about the other things that were going on. People like Gary Gillett, who used to edit Doctor Who magazine. People who are involved in the fan side of things, particularly online, telling that story of... because the rise of online becomes relevant, obviously from the fan side of things, but also from the BBC side of things. We're talking about the era when the BBC website was established and became increasingly popular. And of course, that became an important part of the story because it was they who went off and finally nailed down the rights situation and firmly established there wasn't actually a problem with the rights at all. And obviously, Daniel Judd, who many people will know, did that research. He kindly spoke to me for the book. So it's 30-something people. I should know the exact number, shouldn't I? I think it's about 33 people I've spoken to altogether.
Oh, it's very impressive. And how did you do this? Was it mostly email, or did you get to call people or do video with them now that everyone seems to know how to do video calls in this brave new COVID world?
Yeah, a few of the interviews were done via correspondence, via email. A few people preferred to do it that way, but most of them were done as talking audio interviews, either on the phone or Skype or Zoom or similar, because in my day job, I'm a radio producer, so I'm very used to doing that sort of thing. Of course, you then have the whole issue of transcribing afterwards, which you don't have when you're making radio or podcasts, and transcribing it all and working out, you know, which bits to use in written form. And obviously you have to tidy people's language up a bit in written form, not in terms of, you know, censorship or anything or changing what they say, but obviously people speak in a way that is not always necessarily nice to read on the page, so you have to take out a lot of, you know, you knows and I means and sort ofs and all that kind of thing, and just make it slightly more readable, which I wasn't always great at it, because I had this sort of, you know, I must change as little as possible, you know, I must preserve the sanctity of what they say, but I was leaving in too many of those verbal tics and things originally, so getting used to tidying it up and making it nice readable English was you know, something I had to get used to.
Yeah, gosh, if I was being interviewed, I know there'd be a lot of your knows getting taken out of the text, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'd be the same, exactly the same.
Now, you mentioned working in radio. I believe thus far in your career you've presented and produced radio, you've written feature articles for various outlets, but am I right in thinking this is your first book?
Yes, first proper book, really. I did another book which was about one of the radio shows I work on. There's a charity I think a lot of Doctor Who fans from outside the UK will be aware of, called Children in Need, which the BBC raises money for every year. It's the sort of BBC's official charity that they back, really. And a few years ago, I wrote a book about one of the radio shows at the station I work at as a sort of fundraiser for children in need. And that went quite well. Raised a few £1,000s for children in need. But yeah, I'd say this is the first kind of proper book. But ever since I was tiny, I've always wanted to be a writer. Ever since I was a little child, I've always wanted to be a writer of novels. I've not yet written a novel that was publishable, but I'm kind of okay at I'm much better at writing non-fiction than I am at fiction. So I've written, as you say, a few articles. I've written various bits and pieces for DWM down the years. Their 1983 special that's just come out last week. I wrote a piece about the famous or infamous Longleat Convention, so I've got a piece in that if anybody's got that. So I've always been quite confident with writing non-fiction, and I was fairly confident I could put this together. It was just an issue of them, because basically I wrote the book because I wanted to read it. It was a book that I really wanted to read, and it didn't seem to exist. So I wrote it. That's basically. But I wasn't sure whether anyone else would want to read, but it seems that they do, which is very pleasing.
Oh, that's the best way to do it, isn't it? If no one's done it, do it yourself.
Yeah.
Just mentioning writing the book, of course, how long did it take to write this? Because it seems like it's a sizable tome. It's 350 pages.
Yeah, it's about 110,000 words, I think. It was sort of done in two chunks, one a few years ago and one over the past year. Basically what happened is, in 2015... I've been thinking about all this, you know, I had this idea for a while that I was always fascinated by this process that led from 96 to 03, and I'd written little articles about it online and bits and pieces down the years and things like that. But I don't know if you've ever read the first Doctor Handbook by Hal Stammers and Walker, but it's got this great section in it called the Production Diary, which sort of chronologically lists all sort of memos, and it sets out how everything happened through the entire first Doctor. And the best bit of that is the bit from whenever it is March, April 62 up until the launch of the show, sort of showing how it all came together. And I came up with this idea of, just for fun really, making a kind of timeline version like that from 96 to 03. Obviously I didn't have access to all BBC internal documents and things, but it's interviews, and as I say, there's been various interviews and documentaries and articles and things. So back in 2015, just for fun, I put together a timeline using all these sources and things going from 96 to 03, and I put it up online on the Gallifrey based forum where I'm a member, and loads of people said very nice things about it. They said, oh, this is great, this is someone wrote something like, oh, this is the definitive account of how this happened. Oh, that's very nice.
Lovely.
And it got me thinking, oh, maybe there could be a book in this. So I had a go at writing it back in 2015 into 16, and I wrote about 55,000 words, but it was all done from those kind of secondary sources. I couldn't get many people to talk to me back then. It wasn't that people said, no, I don't want to talk to you. I just never got replies to emails to people's companies and things that they worked for, so it just didn't happen then. So I had this 55,000 word draft that was all done from other sources mostly, apart from one person who did speak to me back then very kindly. But they just kind of lay there. I couldn't really do anything with it because it wasn't really something a publisher would put out at that stage. And then last year, I just decided every year, sort of around New Year, I'd think, oh, this would be the year I'd go back to that book and do it. And last year, I finally went back to it and started asking people again. This time around, as I say, amazingly, almost everyone said yes to me, basically, that I asked to speak to. And over the past year, I've been putting it together, and now it's all ready, or almost ready, to see the light of day.
Fantastic. Do you think that was because of COVID? People just had time on their hands?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I never thought of it as a kind of lockdown project. How everyone had their lockdown project.
Yes.
I never thought of it like that, because I'd always kept meaning to go back to it. But it is true that last year I did end up. I was one of those who was fortunate to still be able to go and work full time. But I did have a bit more free time than I had done before, and I suppose maybe there was a slightly pragmatic thought of, well, maybe all these people will have a bit more free time on their hands now, because obviously television production had just shut down for several months basically. So maybe that did work to my advantage, but it sounds a bit sort of mean-spirited and cynical to say that, doesn't it? But maybe it did, yeah.
Lovely. I noticed 10 Acre Films, which is your publisher, has recently picked up a number of previously published Doctor Who books, like Andrew Cartmell's Script Doctor book. I think they've got Richard Marsden's Verity Lambert biography. But this is the first time around for your book. How did you come into contact with 10 Acre, and what appealed about them to you to become your publisher, or what about you appealed to them?
Well, there's a man who helped me with contacting some of the people, doing some of the interviews for the book, a man called Graham Kibble-White, who's a journalist who writes about television here in the UK. He's written some things for Doctor Who magazine, quite a lot for Doctor Who magazine down the years as well. So Graham had helped me sort out one or two of the interviews for the book very kindly, put me in contact with some people, and he also very kindly read the draft. It was finished, and he was very kind about it and said he thought it was very good. And he is friends with Stuart Manning, who runs 10 Acre. And Graham said to me that he thought Stuart would be interested in publishing it. He said he chatted to Stuart about what the book was about, and Stuart sounded very interested. So when it was all ready to go, I sent it to Stuart, and he very kindly wrote back to me very quickly. He read it very quickly, and obviously, as with anything when you submit to a publisher, he was, there were tweaks and bits and pieces, but substantially. I mean, I was very pleased about the fact that he didn't want wholesale changes made to it. As I say, there were obviously bits and pieces he wanted to tweak, and we've talked about and things. But on the whole, he loved it as it was. And their books, even though obviously it's a small publishing company, sometimes the small publishing companies, without wishing to cause offence, look at their books and you don't think that they always necessarily look particularly professional. Whereas I think if you look at 10 Acres books, I know you should never judge a book by its cover, but if you are judging books by their covers, I think if you look at 10 Acres books, they do look like, well, they are fully professional books, and they look like it. Whereas with some small press companies, that isn't always the case, if you see what I mean.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned the Cartmell Script Doctor book. I have a copy of that published years ago now. It was a limited edition hardcover. It has a lovely, lovely cover. But when I saw the 10 Acre book, I thought, oh, gee, I'd buy that version if I didn't already have this book, because they did a really great cover for it. And likewise, the Verity Lambert book's got a really great cover as well. Yeah,
they're both very of their era, aren't they, those ones? Which, the Script Doctor one, I'm no good with design at all. I've no visual abilities whatsoever. I could never, if I designed a cover for a book, it would probably just be white background with the text on it in black, and that'd be it. But the Script Doctor one, which I think Graham did, didn't he? The Script Doctor cover design, I think. Yeah, it looks. Oh, you can see it, and you think that's 80s. That's definitely late 80s. And similarly with the Verity Lambert one, it's got that very 60s design quality to it. So and Stuart for my book, he very quickly had a cover idea. He came up with this idea, which if you've seen the cover, you'll know that it should be like a model kit, one of those trays of the parts you get in a model kit where they're still in the frame and you haven't snapped them out of the frame yet to put it together. And he thought that'd be a great idea, which was something I would never have thought of in a million years. But I think it works very well. And he got a man called Andrew Orton to CGI the model kit parts for the cover. So thanks to Stuart and Andrew, we have an absolutely lovely cover for the book, which lots of people have been very kind about.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, actually. You got these plastic pieces in their sprues, to use the modelling term for it.
And that's what I didn't know what this term was. Well done, thank you.
The sprues. It's quite a weird word, isn't it? And and the contrast of the colours used is very good. I think it's a very catching cover. It looks very professional. You've kind of given us some background to it there, but was it the only cover that was thought about, or did you just see this one and go, yep, that's the one? Because I think it is the one. I think it looks great.
Yeah, no, it looks great. Yeah, I don't think Stuart mentioned any other ideas. I mean, he just had this idea. One thing he said to me is that he didn't want to have a cover that looked like it was trying to be a Doctor Who novel, with like time vortex swirls and things like that.
Yeah.
He didn't want something like that, but he came up with the sprues idea very quickly, and there were a few different ideas for what colours and things we could use. But no, that idea was set very early on when I signed up with 10 Acre.
Oh, marvellous. Now, without giving the game away on whatever you're going to talk about next, what do you think was the most surprising anecdote you came across while writing the book?
Ooh, I think it might be how the first BBC contact with Russell T Davies about Doctor Who came about, because many people, if you know this story, you probably listen to this podcast because you have some interest in this story anyway, in which case you may know that Russell T Davies was first in contact with the BBC about possibly doing Doctor Who in the late 90s, late 98, early 99. The way Russell T Davies has told the story in various interviews down the years is that his good friend Tony Wood was working in the BBC drama series department, Mal Young's department at the time, and the story Davies always tells is that Tony Wood became aware that the department was interested in reviving Doctor Who, and a meeting was arranged between Russell T Davies and sort of Mal Young's number 2, the head of development in the department, a man called Patrick Spence. Davies has talked about this meeting down the years, and the way Davies tells the story is that he and Patrick Spence had a 20-minute meeting, which was interrupted by Tony Wood, who'd resigned from the BBC that day, turned up drunk, and took Russell off to a bar. And so Patrick Spence's name has come up a few times down the years, but I didn't think anyone had ever spoken to Patrick about this. And Patrick is now the creative director of ITV Studios, so he's in charge of ITV's in-house production arm. So he's a very important man at ITV, Patrick. But I just dropped him an email and asked if he would speak to me for the book, and he emailed back very quickly saying, amazing detective work that you found out about this. And I had to email back and say, well, not really. Russell's talked about it a few times down the years. And he said, oh, well, if Russell's talked about it down the years, I'm very happy to go on the record. And so I got an interview with Patrick, who, as I say, I don't think we've ever heard Patrick's side of the story before. And two things, because I thought, well, he's barely going to remember this. This is one meeting he had over 20 years ago. He's never going to remember this. He's going to say, Doctor Who was I? No, Patrick remembered it very clearly. And he'd been very passionate about trying to get Doctor Who back on. He says it became his absolute ambition. As soon as Russell told him that's what he wanted to do, he says that was it, and he really went for it and wanted to do it. And Mal Young became really keen, and Peter Salmon, who was then the controller of BBC One, they were all really keen to do it. We could have had a Russell T Davies written Doctor Who series on in about 2000 if it weren't for BBC Worldwide trying to get a film made. But the thing that's also interesting about that is that Russell always says it was his friend Tony Wood who put him in touch with Patrick Spence. Patrick tells a slightly different story involving an attempt to save an entirely different TV series altogether. Mm-hmm.
Tell me more.
Well,
or can you tell me more? Or is
I
it
can
best
say,
to read the book?
I don't know how much the book... Well, I mean, it's explained in more detail in the book, but basically, the way Patrick tells it, is that they had been handed a TV series that was going into production by an independent company. It was being made for the BBC by an independent company. And by this stage, the in-house departments didn't have anything to do with the independent productions. They were done separately, but they were handed this independent production that was in trouble, and Mal Young and Patrick Spence were told they had to save it. They read the scripts, which in Patrick Spence's words were indeed ghastly, and they were desperately looking around for a writer to save this show. And Tony Wood recommended that they speak to Russell. Russell said, absolutely no way, I don't want to do that. And so Patrick said, well, what do you want to do? Because he'd read the script. Tony Wood had given Patrick Spence the script for Queer as Folk, the first episode of Queer as Folk, and Spence had fallen in love with it and thought it was one of the best scripts he'd ever read. Became desperate to work with Russell, asked Russell what he wanted to do, and Russell said, I want to do Doctor Who. And Patrick Spence was, yeah, go for it. And as I say, Spence wanted to do it, Mal Young wanted to do it, Peter Salmon wanted to do it, but they, for some reason, control... the BBC Worldwide people I've spoken to deny this, but everyone on the television side says at that point, the late 90s, early 2000s, for some reason BBC Worldwide seemed to have some sort of control over the property, and I wouldn't release it to television. For those who don't know, BBC Worldwide is, or was, the commercial arm of the BBC, the part of the BBC that sells its programmes overseas, looks after merchandise and home media releases and that sort of thing. They've become BBC Studios now and merged in with the old in-house production departments. But at that time, BBC Worldwide was the commercial division, and they seemed to have some hold over Doctor Who and what happened to it.
Crazy. Wow. Now, we mentioned earlier you were obviously watching as the series returned in 2005. If you cast your mind back to how you felt at the time with the series coming back and all of that good stuff, do you think, or do you feel the stories you've uncovered for the book now make you pause and think, like, wow, I never guessed that was going on?
Yeah, interesting. Not so much for the point when the show actually came back on screen, but certainly for those years between 96 and 03. I mean, I was going through a period of my life then which seems like a lifetime in and of itself. 96 and the TV movie was on. I was 12 years old. And then by the time of the announcement in 03, I was a 19-year-old student just starting my second year at university. So you can imagine that gap from 12 to 19. I mean, that feels like, you change a lot over that time. So it felt like a really long period of time to me. And I do, whenever those rumours came up, I remember the DWM report in the autumn of 99 about the new Russell T Davies TV version not happening because there was a film version being developed. I can remember being so disappointed about that. And, I always wondered, I'd read these things in Doctor Who magazine or on the Outpost Gallifrey news page, and I'd always wonder, what was really happening, what was really going on, and would we ever find out? And so, I've always had that. I mean, I think it's a common thing, isn't it, among Doctor Who fans to have this insatiable curiosity about how it's made, to want to open up the bonnet and see how it works. It's like a gateway drug into an interest in television production and television history and things. It is, as Russell T Davies, I think, has said, Doctor Who will be the case study for how British television drama was made, because it is one of the most studied television series of all time. So it fascinates many of us in that way. And yes, definitely when the news stories would emerge through those years about different film or television versions and what was going to happen. And I remember also a couple of months before that, we found out that aborted Russell T Davies version in late 99. There was that very famous, probably the most studied Doctor Who magazine article ever, "We're going to be bigger than Star Wars," by Gary Gillett.
I remember that.
Where he got Russell and Stephen Moffat, Mark Gatiss, Gareth Roberts, Lance Parkin, and he spoke to them all about how Doctor Who might come back. And I remember being, sort of tantalised and fascinated by that. And there's a bit in that article where Gary Gillett wrote, one of these days, before very long, one of these people is going to be possibly in charge of a new version of Doctor Who. And I remember being so excited by that, but it seemed such a long way. I also remember, of course, many people remember that article ends with Russell T Davies saying, "God help anyone in charge of bringing it back. What a responsibility."
Classic Russell. Did you feel, or how excited did you feel when you were writing the book and doing these interviews, in the sense that you're uncovering new information? Because, this is stuff that was largely unknown, or perhaps not at least well-known in fandom, and suddenly you're getting the inside scoop on all this stuff and you're putting it down finally in text. How exciting was that?
It is exciting. It's always exciting to try and find out new things about the series, isn't it? And to try and share things with people that weren't widely known. So it's interesting. I love doing that sort of thing, telling stories about particularly bits of broadcasting history that might not be widely known about. So it's always something I really enjoy doing. And yeah, there is that sort of feeling when, I'm interviewing Patrick Spence and he's telling me about his side of the story of what happened when he had that first meeting with Russell T Davies about Doctor Who. You think, there's little bits and pieces as well about talking to Lorraine Heggessey I interviewed, and she mentioned her number 2 running BBC One, a lady called Helen O'Reilly, who was her channel executive, who I don't think Doctor Who fandom had much awareness of, although she had written an article for the Irish Times back in 2013. But so I got hold of Helen O'Reilly, who'd been Lorraine's number 2 at BBC One, and she's a big Doctor Who fan. She told me all about how when she grew up in Ireland, she got to watch it for free because they could pick up the BBC from the transmissions from Wales across the Irish Sea, and how her dad would be banished from the front room and she would sit and watch Doctor Who as a little girl. And Helen O'Reilly tells this story about when she became Lorraine Heggessey's sort of number 2 at BBC One in late 2002, one of the things she had on her desk was one of those talking Daleks that were around at the time, where you push the button on it and it would go exterminate, seek, locate, annihilate. And Helen says that every morning when she would always get in early before Lorraine to sort of look through the papers, see if there are any stories about BBC One, see what things were coming up through the day that Lorraine might need to be aware of as controller of BBC One. And when Lorraine would come into the office at about 8:45 every morning, apparently she would press the button on this Dalek to make it make some noise. And she said, even if Lorraine was on the phone, I would push the button. And the way Helen tells the story is that eventually Lorraine just came out of her office and said, I'm sick of you pressing that button every day. Find out who owns the rights. We're going to do it. I'm not having you push that button anymore.
Oh, that's fabulous. It leads me to wonder, was there anyone who really surprised you out of the group of people you spoke to, perhaps by the things they told you, like that anecdote you just shared, or even just how generous they were with their time, or even someone you thought, would it be great to speak to them, but they'll never speak to me? Anyone like that?
Well, I think almost everyone, I had the feeling, they'll never speak to me.
Right.
But particularly the people, like Julie Gardner, Jane Tranter, Lorraine Heggessey, Mal Young. I know Mal in particular has often been quite reticent to talk about Doctor Who down the years. I think he's done one podcast interview once a few years ago for a podcast called Gallifrey Stands. And he said on that how he doesn't really often do interviews about Doctor Who. He likes to just speak for himself. And I interviewed Mal. I emailed Mal Young. And I approached him on Twitter and I said, is there an email address I can drop you a line on to talk to you about an interview I'd like to bid for you for? And he gave me his email address on DM and we exchanged emails. And he explained how, he was a bit reticent to talk about Doctor Who. He likes it to speak for itself. And he said about how, fans like to tell what they say is the story of what really happened, and it's not always right. And I often get invited to the Gallifrey convention in Los Angeles. I don't want to do that sort of thing. But in the end, he did. When I explained to him about the book and what I was hoping to do, he did agree to talk. And actually, we ended up speaking for nearly 2 hours. I think we had a much longer chat than I had with anyone else, and it was just fascinating just talking to him. But we had a really nice interview with Mal in the end. But he was someone who, because he had been so reticent down there. And even people like Lorraine Heggessey haven't often talked about Doctor Who down the years. She's obviously been quite a public figure as controller of BBC One and various other high-profile jobs she's done afterwards, but she doesn't often seem to have been interviewed about Doctor Who, so I wasn't sure if she would speak. But again, I approached her on Twitter and messaged her, and we saw, she said, it's very happy to have a chat. So it just goes to show, quite often you worry about these things. You think, that person will never speak to me. Who am I? I'm a complete nobody. But if you actually ask the question, if you present it nicely and explain clearly about what you're doing, and if you seem like you're a vaguely competent person, people will often quite happy to chat to you.
Yeah, if you're making something of quality and they can see that. Yeah, absolutely. Did you go after Russell?
I did approach Russell. I emailed his agent, Bethan, and she did ask him, but very kindly. It was just decided it was something it's a shame. Obviously, it can never be, the perfect book. So it's a shame I didn't get to do my own interview with Russell. But on the other hand, if I was not going to get anyone, in some ways, I know this sounds counterintuitive, not having Russell is it's weird, isn't it, that we call him Russell, because we feel as if we know him because we're so familiar with him from Doctor Who Confidential and all these things. But not having Russell is in some ways the least down, because he has done so many interviews and written so much down the years and appeared in various documents and things, there is a lot of him that obviously, within the bounds of fair use and proper attribution, you can quote from. So there's a lot of his side of the story that you can drop in at various bits and pieces from all the interviews and articles and documentaries which he's done down the years. So in some ways, that was the least damaging. Whereas if I hadn't had someone like Mal Young or Lorraine Heggessey or Jane Tranter or even Julie Gardner, there would have been less material I could have drawn on to try and tell their parts of the story, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does. I mean, back in the day, I know Peter Haining took quotes from William Hartnell and cobbled together a letter from him for one of his books.
I mean, there's the whole Adrian Rigelsford. Is it Rigelsford or Rigelsford? I'm never sure. Issue as well, isn't there? But
that's still a mystery to me. I say Rigelsford.
Yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things. I mean, it's one of those things, isn't it, that you grow up as a Doctor Who fan and you read these names down the years, and sometimes, like, I didn't know for years that it was Gary Gillett. I always thought it was Gary Gillett in my head. So luckily now I do know that it's Gary Gillett, so I can mention that I spoke to him for the book on this podcast and get it right. And if he ever listens to this podcast, he won't be annoyed that I've got his name wrong. And some Mark Gatiss. I thought it was Mark Gatiss for years. I didn't know for years that it was Mark Gatiss. So it is funny that Doctor, that because we read so much about some of these people, we don't always necessarily know how to say their names.
Hello, Gary and Mark, if you're listening.
Yes.
More seriously, though, I think, and this is just my opinion, that maybe Russell would have cast too big a shadow over things if he was involved.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's possible. I mean, we'll never know, obviously, but it would have been interesting to get his views on some of the things, like, you know, to be able to ask him about the story that Patrick Spence told and so forth about what really happened back in 98, 99. But it's funny, isn't it? I kind of thought, well, maybe Russell's just finished with Doctor, because during lockdown last year, he wrote that story about, you know, the death of Novice Hayne, which really felt like, I mean, and when he was tweeting during the watch-alongs, it really kind of felt like he was putting a full stop on his Doctor Who career. I don't know if you felt that way, but it felt like he was sort of saying a final goodbye to the show, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And there are videos of him and Stephen Moffat at some industry event, and they're talking about Doctor Who, and Russell's saying, you know, the minute I stopped doing it, I've forgotten all about it. I'm not doing it anymore. And it seemed very clear he wasn't, but now he is.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's the great Tom Spilsbury interview with them at the launch of the Target books, I think, isn't it? That's a great interview, that one. I
think Tom might be standing behind the camera, yes, somewhere, yeah.
But I mean, Russell, he's always eminently quoted, and as I say, he has written so much and been quoted so much down the years that, as I say, obviously within the bounds of, you know, I'm not just going to reproduce full articles or anything willy-nilly, but within the bounds of fair use and proper attribution, there's a lot of stuff from him that you can quote and reference. So hopefully people won't feel that he is absent from the book.
Maybe a forward or afterword for the second edition. Once
maybe
you never know.
I will send him a copy, but I just hope that he doesn't pick it up and say either, "That's not right," or "He's got it wrong on the first page. Why didn't he ask someone who was there?"
Now, we mentioned earlier that the book is 350 pages in total. I mean, that's a lot of story. Were you surprised when you got to the end and saw how much there had been to say on this topic?
It's interesting. I mean, yes and no. I always felt that there was a book length project in it, because there was so much to cover, the aftermath of the TV movie and what the situation was immediately after that, the arrival of some of these people at the BBC, or in some cases back at the BBC, who were involved in the process which led to the recommissioning. As I say, the film efforts, some of the other stuff that was going on in the background at the time. Like, I mean, it tries to deal as well with the bits and pieces, like, you know, the cultural perception of Doctor Who in the UK and how that gradually changed. There's a point, I think, from sort of the mid-90s on into the late 90s, where it starts becoming something that the BBC wasn't as embarrassed about. I say the BBC as if the BBC is some great monolith that, you know, everyone thinks the same. But you see things in the late 90s, like, you know, when it won the TV 60 award in 96 as the best popular drama. And not just that, but the fact that, you know, for the opening titles of the TV 60 awards, which is celebrating 60 years, the entire history of BBC television, and what do they have to represent the 60s in the opening title sequence of this gala show celebrating 60 years of BBC television? They have the Daleks in Power of the Daleks. And where they were launching digital television, they used the Daleks. When they had their trail in the late 90s celebrating the great legacy of BBC children's television, even though it's never made by the Children's Department, they had Daleks in it. You know, it's Doctor Who generally, and the Daleks particularly, seemed to become, in the late 90s, this kind of one of these totems of the BBC's history, and Doctor Who seemed to become part of its history and its heritage that they were less embarrassed about than maybe they had been at the end of the 80s, perhaps.
Is there any overall narrative the book works towards, like, gosh, the show almost didn't come back, or hey, it could have been a lot different, kids, or anything like that? Or is there just so much going on, it's hard to have an overall narrative?
Yeah, I don't know if there's, I mean, there's kind of overall timeline to it, I'd say. You work your way sort of from 96 to 03. But I wouldn't say there was a kind of overall... I mean, as with all of these things, without wishing to sound like I'm paraphrasing the Eighth Doctor in the TV movie, there are endless sequences of coincidences and happenstance and things that lead to anything happening. As I say, if BBC Worldwide hadn't been so fixated on making a film, we could have had a Russell T Davies series in about 2000. Well, actually, one of the interesting things Patrick Spence says is that he doesn't necessarily think it's a bad thing it didn't happen then, because even in just the few years that did pass, the visual effects, the CGI technology had become so much more affordable and so much better at a BBC level that he thinks it was probably a better product when it came back than it might have been had they launched it in 2000. I suppose one of the things that comes up is how Doctor Who got very lucky with its timing, in the sense that one of the things that was going on in the early 2000s is that the BBC was in a very confident and well-funded era. A man called Greg Dyke became the Director General in 2000, and he was very much a populist. He had this phrase that he wanted to cut the crap at the BBC. He wanted to cut back on the levels of bureaucracy and management, all that kind of thing, and actually get things done. And he actually benefited from something his predecessor John Burt had done, and got the BBC a very good licence fee deal with the government, an above inflation licence fee settlement. So the BBC had quite a lot of money in the early 2000s. And so they had a very confident year. They were launching lots of successful dramas. I mean, 2000's a real watershed, I think. Greg Dyke became the Director General. Lorraine Heggessey became controller of BBC One. Jane Tranter became controller of drama commissioning, and they launched lots of new dramas. BBC One had a new schedule. It was just a very confident and successful and well-funded era. And Doctor Who gets recommissioned autumn 03. Beginning of 04, Greg Dyke has to go. There's a big journalistic controversy, and he has to resign. A huge story in the UK. I mean, the huge protests by BBC staff outside buildings. There was a lot of fury about among BBC staff that he'd had to go. It was felt that he'd been made a scapegoat. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's sort of side. But anyway, Greg Dyke has to go at the beginning of 04. Mark Thompson comes in as director, and at the same time Greg Dyke went, the chairman of the BBC, Gavin Davis, he also had to go because of the same controversy. So the Director General and the Chairman go, and a new Director General and Chairman come in. And Mark Thompson comes in as Director General, and the Chairman of the BBC is a non-executive role. The Chairman of the BBC has no say in programme making, so it's a non-executive Chairman. But in 04, the person who becomes Chairman of the BBC is Michael Grade, and the story that Jane Tranter tells is that Mark Thompson, the new Director General, she thinks, because of his worries about Michael Grade's views, Mark Thompson asks Jane Tranter, can we stop this? Can we stop this Doctor Who project? And she goes, no, of course we can't, because they'd announced it. It had been a huge story in the press. It was well into pre-production. I mean, they were almost, I can't remember when Thompson came in. I think it was the summer of 04. So they would have been starting production by that point. So it was Lorraine Heggessey, I put this to her, and she said, oh yes, I do remember that. And then she sort of laughed and said, well, it was too late by then.
The horse had bolted.
Yes,
wow.
Yeah. So, but I think Doctor Who did come just in time to benefit from that. Even though Dyke had gone by the time it made it to air, it came just in time to benefit from that confident, well-funded Greg Dyke era of the BBC.
A fascinating time. Okay, folks, the book is The Long Game, 1996 to 2003, the inside story of how the BBC brought back Doctor Who. It's £12.99 and published by 10 Acre Films. You can find them at 10acrefilms.bigcartel.com. Paul Hayes, it's been a great pleasure to have you talk with us on the Doctor Who show today. Is there anything you'd like to leave our listeners with about the book?
Well, yeah, I think particularly people might listen to this and they might think, oh, that sounds all very complicated, the history. But if I don't know much about the history of the BBC and things, will I be confused? But I very much tried to write the book with the feeling that it would be picked up and read by someone who didn't know anything about the internal organisation of the BBC. You know, without wishing to make it an oversimplification and patronising, I've tried to make it accessible and explain things, and not assume that everyone knows what the difference is between an in-house production and an independent production, and try to explain things about, the different parts of the BBC, regional branches of the BBC, and why these are important and why this had an effect on Doctor Who. So I've tried to write it with keeping in mind that there'll be people picking it up, hopefully, who don't know about these things, and hopefully it explains in a friendly and accessible way the impenetrable organisational chaos of the BBC in the late 90s and the early 2000s. So hopefully it does go into this sort of complex tale, but hopefully tells it in an accessible way.
Marvellous. Well, it ships from November 1st, and I wish you all great success with it, Paul. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you very much, indeed. Thank you for having me on the show.
Pleasure.